I'm Dr. Kristine Walters, 34. And 3 weeks ago, I became the youngest woman to ever win the Nobel Prize in chemistry. But growing up, my third-grade teacher, Mrs. Henderson, told my parents I was mentally deficient and would never amount to anything. Asterisk. For 26 years, those words echoed in my head every single day. Last Saturday, I walked into her 40th wedding anniversary party as the guest of honor invited by her daughter, who had no idea about our history. What happened next left 200 guests in stunned silence and Mrs. Henderson collapsing to the floor. Like this video if you've ever had someone crush your dreams, because what I'm about to tell you will show you exactly how to turn that pain into power. But let me take you back to where it all began. I was 8 years old, sitting in Mrs. Henderson's third-grade classroom at Riverside Elementary, struggling to read aloud from our science textbook. The words seemed to dance on the page, letters, flipping and rearranging themselves in ways that made no sense. While my classmates read smoothly, I stammered through each sentence, my cheeks burning with embarrassment. Mrs. Henderson, a stern woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun, would tap her pen impatiently on her desk whenever I stumbled. "Kristine, focus," she'd say sharply. "The other children don't have this much trouble." I tried so hard to focus, I really did. But the harder I concentrated, the more the letters seemed to swim away from me. Math was easier. I could see patterns in relationships that others missed, but reading remained my nemesis. Mrs. Henderson interpreted my struggles as laziness, defiance, or worse. The parent-teacher conference that changed my life happened. On a cold October evening, I was supposed to be in bed, but I crept to the top of the stairs when I heard my parents' voices mixing with Mrs. Henderson's in our living room. What I heard that night would haunt me for decades. "Mr. and Mrs. Walters," Mrs. Henderson began, her voice carrying that familiar tone of authority. "I'm afraid Kristine is not progressing as she should. Her reading comprehension is well below grade level, and she shows signs of what we might call mental deficiency." I pressed my face against the stair railings, my heart pounding. Mental deficiency? What did that mean? "She's a bright child at home," my mother protested weakly. "She asks such interesting questions about how things work." Mrs. Henderson's laugh was cold. "Mrs. Walters, I've been teaching for 23 years. I know the signs. Kristine lacks the cognitive ability to succeed academically. She's easily distracted, can't follow simple instructions, and frankly, she's holding back the entire class." My father's voice was barely audible. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm recommending that Kristine be placed in special education classes for developmentally delayed children. She needs to be in an environment suited to her limitations. Continuing in regular classes would be cruel to her and unfair to the other students." The words hit me like physical blows. Developmentally delayed limitations. I wrapped my arms around my knees, making myself as small as possible. But her grades. In math, my mother tried again. Rote memorization. Mrs. Henderson dismissed. "She's learned to mimic patterns without understanding. Trust me, I've seen this before. Children like Kristine hit a wall around 4th grade when abstract thinking becomes necessary. She simply doesn't have the intellectual capacity." Then came the words that would echo in my mind for the next 26 years. "I'm sorry to be blunt, but Kristine will never amount to anything academically. It's better to adjust your expectations now than face disappointment later." I heard my mother's quiet sob, my father's resigned sigh. They believed her. Why wouldn't they? She was the expert, the professional educator with decades of experience. I was just their struggling 8-year-old daughter who couldn't read properly. I crept back to my room, clutching my report card that I'd hidden under my pillow. All those C's and D's in reading and language arts, stark evidence of my failure. The comments section was filled with Mrs. Henderson's neat handwriting, shows little improvement. Lacks focus, below grade level expectations. That night I stared at the ceiling and felt something die inside me. If Mrs. Henderson was right, if I really was mentally deficient, then what was the point of trying? The dreams I'd had of becoming a scientist, of understanding how the world worked, suddenly seemed impossibly foolish. From that day forward, Mrs. Henderson's assessment became my internal truth. Every time I struggled with a concept, every time I felt confused or overwhelmed, her voice would whisper, "You're not smart enough. You'll never amount to anything." The report card became my artifact of shame, a tangible reminder of my supposed intellectual inadequacy. I kept it hidden in my bedroom drawer, but I never forgot its contents. It was proof that I was broken, different, less than my peers. Little did I know that this cruel verdict would eventually become the fuel for my greatest triumph. The special education placement letter arrived 2 weeks later, stamped with the school district's effigie. The special education placement letter arrived 2 weeks later, stamped with the school district's official seal. My mother's hands trembled as she read it aloud to my father, thinking I couldn't hear from the kitchen where I was pretending to do homework. The letter was clinical, cold. Kristine Walters has been recommended for placement in the Resource Learning Center to address her developmental and cognitive delays. That document became another artifact of my supposed inadequacy, filed away in the family records like a medical diagnosis. I was officially labeled noun, just struggling but deficient. The letter recommended modified curriculum expectations, an alternative assessment method suitable for her learning capacity. My new classroom was in the basement of Riverside Elementary, down a hallway that other students rarely visited. The Resource Learning Center had 12 desks arranged in a horseshoe pattern, fluorescent lights that flickered intermittently, and the distinct smell of industrial disinfectant that couldn't quite mask something else. The scent of resignation. Mrs. Patterson, my new teacher, was kind but spoke to us like we were much younger than our actual ages. "Good morning, boys and girls," she'd sing-song each day, her voice artificially bright. "Let's practice our letter sounds." We were 8 and 9 years old, but she treated us like preschoolers, who might break if pushed too hard. The other kids, in my regular classes, quickly learned where I spent half my day. "Kristine goes to the dummy room," Tommy Martinez announced loudly during lunch one day, causing a ripple of snickers across the cafeteria. "My sister says that's where they put the retards." The word hit me like a slap. I stared down at my tuna sandwich, my appetite vanishing. Even at 8, I understood that this label would follow me everywhere. I was no longer just Kristine. I was Kristine from the special class, Kristine who needs help, Kristine-who-isn, single quotes T-as-smart. But here's what nobody knew, what I kept secret even from my parents. I was fascinated by how things worked. While my classmates played with dolls or video games, I collected rocks and examined them with my dad's old magnifying glass. I wondered why some were smooth and others rough, why they came in different colors, what made them sparkle in the sunlight. I had dozens of questions that I never dared ask. Why did soap make bubbles? How did plants know which way to grow? What made the sky blue during the day but orange at sunset? These questions burned inside me, but I'd learned to keep them quiet. Smart kids asked questions like these. I wasn't supposed to be smart. Mrs. Henderson still taught my math class the one regular subject. I remained in, and her attitude toward me had shifted from impatience to something worse, pity mixed with vindication. She'd proven her point about my limitations, and now she could afford to be patronizingly gentle. "That's a good try, Kristine," she'd say, when I solved a problem incorrectly, her voice dripping with false encouragement. "Remember, we don't expect the same from everyone." But when I got answers right, which happened more often than she seemed to notice, she'd barely acknowledge it, as if my success was somehow accidental or irrelevant. The cruel irony was that math made perfect sense to me. Numbers behaved logically. They followed rules I could understand. While I struggled to decode the symbols on a page when reading, mathematical equations spoke to me clearly. But Mrs. Henderson had already decided that any apparent ability I showed was just rote memorization without real understanding. During parent conferences, she'd shake her head sympathetically. "Kristine is doing as well as can be expected, given her limitations. The special education program is really the best place for her." My parents would nod, sadly, accepting this expert opinion about their daughter's future at home. I began to retreat into myself. I stopped asking my endless questions about how the world worked. I stopped volunteering answers even when I knew them. I learned to make myself small, invisible, unremarkable. If everyone expected so little from me, maybe it was easier to just meet those low expectations. The placement letter remained in my parents' filing cabinet, a constant reminder of my official status as educationally deficient. Sometimes I'd sneak into their bedroom and read it again, memorizing phrases like cognitive processing difficulties and below-average intellectual functioning. The clinical language felt like chains around my potential. Years later, I would understand that I had dyslexia, a learning difference, not a learning disability, and certainly not a sign of low intelligence. But at 8 years old, all I knew was that I'd been sorted into a category that felt permanent and shameful. The smart kids were in advanced classes. I was in the basement with flickering lights and lowered expectations. What I didn't realize then was that this systematic underestimation of my abilities was creating something powerful inside me. A quiet, burning determination to prove everyone wrong. Mrs. Henderson's crushing verdict had been meant to limit me, but it was actually forging something unbreakable in my spread, a refusal to accept other people's definitions of my worth. The special education placement letter had labeled me as limited, but it couldn't contain the questions that still burned in my mind or the fascination with the natural world that no amount of institutional dismissal could extinguish. 2 years into my exile in the Resource Learning Center, something unexpected happened that would change the trajectory of my entire life. It was Christmas morning when I was 10, and my grandmother, my mother's mother, who lived 3 states away and visited only twice a year, had driven through a snowstorm to spend the holidays with us. Grandma Rose was different from my parents. She was a retired high school chemistry teacher who'd spent 40 years inspiring students, and she had a way of looking at me that felt different from everyone else's gaze. While others saw my struggles and limitations, she seemed to see something else entirely. "I have something special for you, Kristine," she said that morning, pulling a large wrapped box from behind the Christmas tree. My parents exchanged worried glances. They'd grown protective of me, afraid that gifts requiring too much thinking or reading might lead to frustration and tears. I unwrapped the box carefully, revealing something that made my heart skip: a beginner's chemistry set. Not a toy version with plastic test tubes and colored water, but a real kit with actual glass equipment, pH strips, and various powders and solutions in properly labeled containers. "Rose," I don't think my mother started, but Grandma held up her hand. "The girl asks more questions about how the world works than any child I've ever met," she said firmly. "She needs answers, not limitations." My father frowned. "But her teachers say she can't handle complex concepts. This might be too advanced for her level." "Whose level?" Grandma Rose's voice carried an edge I'd never heard before. "Some arbitrary standard set by people who've known her for a few months. I've been watching this child since she was born. She has the mind of a scientist." I stared at the chemistry set, afraid to touch it. What if I couldn't understand it? What if I proved once again that I wasn't smart enough? But Grandma Rose sat beside me and opened the instruction manual. "Let's start with something simple," she said. "How about we make some colored flames?" She showed me how to prepare solutions of different metals: saltscope or sulfate, sodium chloride, potassium chloride. Then we went outside to the back porch, and she helped me dip wooden splints into each solution before holding them over a candle flame. The results were magical. The copper sulfate created brilliant green flames. The sodium burned bright orange, and the potassium produced a beautiful purple. But what amazed me wasn't just the colors, it was understanding why they happened. Each metal has its own signature, Grandma explained as we watched the flames dance. When heated, their electrons get excited and jump to higher energy levels. When they fall back down, they release light at specific wavelengths. That's why each metal makes its own color. For the first time in 2 years, I felt something click in my brain. This wasn't rote memorization or pattern mimicking. This was real understanding. I could visualize the electrons dancing, jumping, releasing their energy as light. It made perfect sense. "Can we try mixing them?" I asked eagerly. "What happens if we combine the copper and sodium solutions?" Grandma Rose smiled, the first genuinely proud smile an adult had given me in years. "That's exactly the right question to ask. Let's find out." We spent the entire afternoon experimenting. I mixed solutions, observed reactions, and asked question after question. Grandma answered each one seriously, never talking down to me or suggesting that concepts were too complex for my level. When we created a small volcano using baking soda and vinegar with food coloring, I immediately wanted to know why it worked. Grandma explained acid-base reactions, how the acetic acid in vinegar reacted with the sodium bicarbonate to produce carbon dioxide gas, creating the eruption effect. The chemical equation is HC2H3O2 plus NaHCO3, yields NaC2H3O2 plus H2O plus CO2, she said, writing it out for me. The carbon dioxide is what makes it bubble and foam. I stared at the equation, these symbols that represented the invisible dance of atoms and molecules. Unlike the letters that swam and flipped when I tried to read, these chemical formulas stayed still and made sense. They were like a secret language that described how the universe actually worked. My parents watched from the kitchen window, still skeptical. They'd been conditioned by years of teacher conferences and special education meetings to expect failure, to prepare for disappointment. The idea that their cognitively delayed daughter might actually have a gift seemed impossible. But Grandma Rose saw what others missed. After dinner, she pulled my parents aside for a serious conversation I wasn't supposed to overhear. "That child has an exceptional mind for science," she told them firmly. "She understands complex concepts intuitively. Her questions are sophisticated, her observations are acute, and her ability to see patterns is remarkable." "But her teachers say," my mother began. "Her teachers are wrong," Grandma interrupted. "I've taught chemistry for 40 years. I know. Scientific aptitude when I see it. Kristine has dyslexia, not intellectual disability. There's an enormous difference. That night, I fell asleep clutching the chemistry set's instruction manual, my first real chemistry textbook. The words were still difficult to decode, but the diagrams and equations spoke to me clearly. For the first time since Mrs. Henderson's devastating verdict, I felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as limited as everyone believed. Maybe the questions burning in my mind weren't evidence of confusion, but signs of genuine curiosity. Maybe wanting to understand how the world worked wasn't beyond my capacity after all. The chemistry set became my most treasured possession, the artifact that ignited my transformation from a labeled failure into someone who dared to dream of scientific understanding. It was the first tool that allowed me to prove, if only to myself, that my mind was capable of grasping complex ideas. In the quiet of my bedroom that Christmas night, mixing tiny amounts of safe chemicals and watching their predictable reactions, I began to suspect that Mrs. Henderson might have been spectacularly wrong about my potential. The chemistry set changed everything, but changing the system that had labeled me proved far more difficult. For 2 years, I conducted secret experiments in my bedroom, growing more confident in my abilities while remaining trapped in the resource. Learning centers lowered expectations. It wasn't until 7th grade that someone finally noticed the disconnect between my potential and my placement, Mrs. Garcia. The middle school guidance counselor was reviewing student files when she spotted something that didn't add up. During our first meeting, she spread my academic records across her desk like pieces of a puzzle that didn't fit together. "Kristine, I'm looking at your math scores and they're consistently above grade level," she said, tapping her pen thoughtfully. "But your reading scores and overall placement suggest significant cognitive delays. That's unusual." I sat in her office fidgeting with my hands, afraid to hope. No one had questioned my placement in years. My parents had accepted it. My teachers had reinforced it. And I'd learned to keep my scientific curiosity hidden to avoid disappointment. "Tell me," Mrs. Garcia continued, "what do you like to do at home?" For a moment, I hesitated. Then something about her genuine interest gave me courage. "I like chemistry," I said quietly. "I have a chemistry set, and I do experiments." Her eyebrows rose. "What kind of experiments?" "Well, last week I was testing different household substances to see which ones are acids or bases using pH strips. I made a chart showing how lemon juice and vinegar are very acidic, while baking soda and soap are basic." The words tumbled out faster as I gained confidence. "I also experimented with crystallization using salt and sugar solutions at different temperatures to see how crystal formation changes." Mrs. Garcia leaned forward, suddenly very interested. "And you understand why these reactions happen?" "Oh, yes," I said, my voice growing stronger. "The pH scale measures hydrogen ion concentration. Acids have more hydrogen ions. Bases have fewer. Until they form organized structures." She was quiet for a long moment, studying my file again. The battle that followed was unlike anything my family had experienced. Mrs. Garcia recommended comprehensive testing, not the basic assessments that had labeled me years earlier, but detailed cognitive and psychological evaluations designed to identify specific learning differences rather than general deficiencies. The school district resisted. Mrs. Henderson, now the assistant principal, argued that extensive testing was unnecessary and expensive for a student who was functioning appropriately in her current placement. She insisted that my apparent interest in science was superficial, that I was simply mimicking concepts without true understanding. But Mrs. Garcia was relentless. She'd seen too many bright students misplaced because of undiagnosed learning differences. She fought meetings, filed formal requests, and eventually threatened to involve the state education department if proper testing wasn't conducted. My parents, initially hesitant to rock the boat, finally agreed to support the evaluation process. Years of watching me struggle had worn them down, but they'd also noticed my growing confidence with my chemistry experiments. Maybe they began to hope there was more to their daughter than the labels suggested. The testing took 3 days and covered everything from basic intelligence to specific cognitive processing abilities. Dr. Martinez, the educational psychologist, administered tests I'd never seen before, puzzles that required spatial reasoning, pattern recognition tasks, memory assessments, and detailed analysis of how I processed written versus verbal information. During one particularly memorable session, Dr. Martinez presented me with a complex chemistry problem involving molecular structures and asked me to explain my reasoning aloud. As I worked through the solution, describing how different atoms would bond based on their electron configurations, I watched her expression change from professional skepticism to genuine amazement. Murmured, making notes. "How did you learn this?" "I read about it," I said, then caught myself. "Well, I mean, I looked at the diagrams and figured out the patterns. The reading part is hard, but the concepts make sense. 3 weeks later, the results arrived in a thick envelope that would become another artifact in my educational journey, but this time, one that liberated rather than limited me. The IQ test revealed scores in the superior range, with particularly high marks in logical reasoning and spatial intelligence. But the report also confirmed what Grandma Rose had suspected. I had severe dyslexia that had masked my intellectual abilities for years. Kristine demonstrates exceptional analytical abilities and scientific reasoning, the report stated. Her apparent academic deficiencies are attributable to dyslexia, not cognitive limitation. Current educational placement is inappropriate and potentially harmful to her intellectual development. The recommendations were clear: immediate removal from special education, placement in advanced classes with appropriate accommodations for dyslexia, and access to enriched curriculum that matched her actual abilities. Mrs. Henderson was furious. During the placement meeting, she sat stiffly in her chair, her jaw clenched as Dr. Martinez presented the findings. "These tests can be misleading," she argued. "I've worked with this child for years. I know her limitations." "With respect," Dr. Martinez replied firmly, "the limitations appear to have been imposed rather than inherent. Kristine has been significantly underserved by her current placement." My mother cried when she heard the results. Stares of relief, guilt, and anger all mixed together. "We trusted you," she said to Mrs. Henderson. "You convinced us our daughter wasn't capable, and we believed you." Mrs. Henderson's face flushed red. "I stand by my professional assessment. This child has been in special education for years. You can't simply pretend that didn't happen." But Dr. Martinez's report was unambiguous. The girl who'd been labeled mentally deficient actually possessed superior intelligence. The child who would never amount to anything had been held back by people who confused learning differences with learning disabilities. The IQ test results became my new artifact, proof that labels don't define intelligence, that potential can be hidden beneath surface struggles, and that one person's professional opinion can be devastatingly wrong. Those test scores didn't just change my educational placement, they changed how I saw myself. For the first time in years, I had official documentation that I wasn't broken or limited or deficient. I was a student with dyslexia who happened to have a gift for scientific reasoning. The difference was everything as I left the middle school that day. Knowing I'd be starting advanced classes the following semester, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before Mrs. Henderson's crushing verdict: hope for my future and confidence in my own mind. The system had tried to define me by my weaknesses, but Dr. Martinez's evaluation revealed my strengths. Now I had to learn to believe in those strengths myself. High school felt like entering a completely different world. For the first time since 3rd grade, I was in advanced classes with students who shared my curiosity about how things worked. My schedule included honors, chemistry, advanced biology. Just 2 years earlier, when I was still labeled as cognitively delayed. Dr. Peterson, my chemistry teacher, was nothing like Mrs. Henderson. He was enthusiastic, encouraging, and genuinely excited when students asked complex questions. During my first week, when I raised my hand to ask about electron orbital hybridization during a lesson on molecular bonding, he didn't dismiss me or suggest the concept was too advanced. Instead, his eyes lit up. "Excellent question, Kristine. That's exactly what we'll be covering in our advanced unit. You're thinking like a real chemist." Those words, "thinking like a real chemist," hit me like electricity. For so many years, I'd been told I couldn't think properly at all. Now someone was suggesting I thought like a scientist. I threw myself into my studies with an intensity that surprised everyone, including myself. The accommodations for my dyslexia extended time on tests, the ability to use audio recordings for reading assignments, and alternative formats for note-taking removed the barriers that had hidden my abilities for so long. Without the constant struggle to decode text, my mind was free to engage with the actual concepts. My grades reflected this newfound freedom. A+ after A in all my science courses. My lab reports were detailed and insightful. My understanding of complex chemical processes impressed even Dr. Peterson, who'd been teaching for 15 years. "Your daughter has exceptional scientific aptitude," he told my parents during conferences. "She sees connections and patterns that most students miss entirely. Have you considered having her participate in the regional science fair?" The science fair. It felt like such a normal high school activity. Yet for me it represented something profound, a chance to prove publicly that Mrs. Henderson's assessment had been wrong, that I could not only understand complex concepts but contribute original thinking to the scientific community. I decided to investigate the synthesis and properties of biodegradable polymers, a project that combined my interests in chemistry and environmental science. experimenting with different combinations of organic compounds to create plastics that would break down naturally without harming the environment. The work was challenging in the best possible way. I had to understand polymer chemistry, research existing biodegradable materials, design my own synthesis protocols, and analyze the properties of my results. Each step required the kind of complex thinking that Mrs. Henderson had insisted evening when I was testing a new polymer I'd created using modified cornstarch and a novel cross-linking agent, comparable strength, Dr. Peterson. "Look at this," I called excitedly. Adjusting the microscope for him to see, he examined the sample carefully, his expression growing more amazed by the minute. "Kristine, this is remarkable. You've created something genuinely innovative. The crystalline structure is unlike anything I've seen in student work." My heart pounded as the implications sank in. I hadn't just completed a science fair, actually discovered something new, something that could potentially help solve real environmental problems. The regional science fair was held at the convention center downtown, with hundreds of projects from students across 3 counties. I felt a familiar flutter of the old self-doubt. What if I didn't belong here? What if my project wasn't actually as good as Dr. Peterson thought? But then I remembered my polymer samples, the hours of careful research, the genuine excitement I felt when explaining my work to others. I belonged here not because someone had finally given me permission, but because I'd earned my place through curiosity, effort, and genuine scientific contribution. The judges who visited my display were impressed. "Dr. Sarah Chen from the state, this is undergraduate-level research," she told me. "Have you thought about pursuing chemistry in college?" College, the word sent a thrill through me. For years, I'd assumed higher education was beyond my reach. Now, a professor was suggesting I had the ability to succeed at the university level. When they announced the winners, I stood with the other finalists, my heart hammering against my ribs. Third place went to a project on renewable energy. Second place to a study of local water quality. And first place for her innovative work on biodegradable polymer synthesis. Kristine Walters from Riverside High School. The applause was thunderous, but all I could hear was the sound of barriers crashing down, perhaps finally understanding how wrong she'd been. The regional science fair trophy became my new artifact, tangible proof that the girl who would never amount to anything had just won recognition for original scientific research. It sat proudly on my desk at home, catching the light from my bedroom window, a constant reminder that potential can't be contained by other people's limited vision. Local newspapers covered my win, and suddenly I was the student who overcame learning disabilities to excel in science. While I appreciated the attention, I knew the real story was more complex. I'd simply been allowed to show abilities that had always existed. College recruiters began contacting me, interested in my research and my academic turnaround. For the first time, I began to dream beyond high school. I still heard Mrs. Henderson's voice whispering its old refrain, "You'll never amount to anything." The trophy on my desk proved her wrong, but part of me wondered if this success was somehow a fluke. If I'd eventually hit the limitations she'd predicted, I didn't know then that this was just the beginning, that the confidence I was building would carry me far beyond what any of us could imagine. The shy, struggling girl who'd hidden in the basement resource learning center was becoming someone else, entirely someone who dared to believe in her own potential. The thick envelope from MIT arrived on a rainy Thursday in March, and I stared at it for 10 minutes before finding the courage to open it. My hands shook as I unfolded the acceptance letter, reading the words that seemed impossible. "We are pleased to offer you admission to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology with a full academic scholarship." A full scholarship to MIT. The same girl who'd been labeled mentally deficient was being invited to study at one of the world's most prestigious scientific institutions. The letter became my most treasured artifact, proof that redemption was not only possible but complete. My parents cried when I showed them the letter. My father, who'd sat silently through so many disappointing teacher conferences, wrapped me in a hug and whispered, "I'm so sorry we ever doubted you." My mother kept reading the letter over and over as if she couldn't quite believe it was real. "Full scholarship," she kept repeating. "They want to pay for everything because they believe in you." But believing in myself proved harder than convincing. Admissions committees. When I arrived at MIT that fall, imposter syndrome hit me like a physical force. Walking across campus surrounded by students who'd attended elite prep schools and specialized STEM programs, I felt like an intruder who'd somehow slipped past security. My freshman chemistry class was taught by Dr. Elizabeth Nakamura, a brilliant researcher whose textbook I'd studied in high school, sitting in her lecture hall with 300 other students, many of whom seemed to already know advanced concepts I was just learning. I felt the familiar whisper of Mrs. Henderson's voice, "You don't belong here." The coursework was brutally challenging: organic chemistry, physical chemistry, advanced calculus, and physics, all at a pace that assumed students could absorb complex information rapidly. My dyslexia meant I needed more time to process written materials, and despite accommodations, I often felt like I was running uphill while everyone else sprinted on flat ground. But then, something remarkable happened during my first lab session. We were synthesizing aspirin from salicylic acid, a relatively simple procedure, but I found myself noticing details that others missed. When my lab partner's reaction wasn't proceeding as expected, I suggested adjusting the pH of the solution. "How? Did you know to try that?" she asked, as her yield dramatically improved. "The reaction mechanism requires a specific protonation state," I explained. "If the pH is too high, the carboxyl group won't be properly activated for the acetylation reaction." Dr. Rodriguez, our lab instructor, overheard the conversation and approached our bench. "That's sophisticated reasoning, Kristine. Most students don't think mechanistically in their first semester." Those words ignited something in me. I might struggle with reading dense textbooks, but I could see molecular interactions in my mind like a three-dimensional movie. Chemical reactions weren't abstract concepts to me. They were stories about atoms and electrons, about energy and transformation. I began spending extra hours in the lab, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. While other students memorized reaction mechanisms, I understood them intuitively. I could predict how molecules would behave based on their electronic structure, and what had seemed like limitations in elementary school were actually different ways of processing information that gave me unique insights. My grades reflected this growing confidence: A's in all my chemistry courses, strong performance in physics and mathematics. But more importantly, I was beginning to see myself as a scientist rather than someone pretending to be one. The real breakthrough came during spring semester when Dr. Nakamura offered me a position in her research group. "Your understanding of molecular behavior is exceptional," she told me during our meeting. "I think you'd contribute meaningfully to our work on catalytic mechanisms research, real cutting-edge scientific research as an undergraduate." I thought about Mrs. Henderson's prediction that I'd never amount to anything, as I accepted the position that would change my life. Dr. Nakamura's lab focused on developing new catalysts for sustainable chemical processes. My project involved investigating how different metal centers affected the efficiency of carbon-carbon bond formation reactions. It was complex work that required understanding quantum mechanics, coordination, chemistry, and reaction kinetics at a sophisticated level. But as I delved into the research, something clicked. The concepts that had once seemed impossibly advanced now felt natural, intuitive. I could visualize how electrons moved during reactions, how different molecular geometries affected reaction rates, how subtle changes in catalyst structure could dramatically improve performance. My first experiment yielded unexpected results. The catalyst I'd synthesized showed activity patterns that didn't match literature predictions. Instead of dismissing the data as experimental error, I became curious about why the reaction was behaving differently. "Dr. Nakamura, I think there might be a secondary coordination sphere effect that's not accounted for in the current models," I suggested during our weekly group meeting, presenting my data carefully. She studied my results for a long moment, then looked up with excitement in her eyes. "You're absolutely right. This could be a significant finding. Can you design experiments to test your hypothesis?" For the next 3 months, I threw myself into investigating this unexpected phenomenon. Long days in the lab, evenings spent reading research papers, weekends analyzing data. The work was demanding but exhilarating. I was contributing original knowledge to the scientific community, adding pieces to humanity's understanding of how chemical reactions work. When our research was ready for publication, Dr. Nakamura insisted I be listed as co-first author on the paper. "Your insights drove this discovery," she told me. "You've done graduate-level work as a sophomore." Seeing my name on a peer-reviewed publication in the Journal of the American Chemical Society was surreal. Kristine Walters, the girl who'd been placed in special education for cognitive delays, was now a published researcher contributing to scientific knowledge. The MIT acceptance letter remained framed on my dorm room wall, but it had been joined by other artifacts of achievement: research awards, academic honors, recommendation letters from professors who saw my potential rather than my limitations late at night in the lab, pipetting solutions and monitoring reactions. I often thought about the journey that had brought me here. From Mrs. Henderson's crushing verdict to MIT's research labs, it seemed impossible. Yet here I was, living proof that potential can't be contained by other people's narrow vision. But I also knew this was just the beginning. Graduate school beckoned with opportunities to delve even deeper into the mysteries of molecular behavior. The girl who'd once been told she'd never succeed academically was now dreaming of a PhD, of becoming a professor, of making discoveries that could change the world. Mrs. Henderson's words still echoed sometimes, but now they served a different purpose. Instead of limiting me, they reminded me how far I'd come and fueled my determination to go even further. The rejection letter from Harvard's chemistry PhD program arrived on a cold February morning. During my senior year at MIT, I opened it expecting acceptance. My undergraduate research had been published. My grades were stellar, and my professors had written glowing recommendations. Instead, I found myself staring at polite but devastating words. While your application shows promise, we feel you would benefit from additional research experience before pursuing doctoral studies. The letter became another artifact in my collection, but this time one that stung rather than celebrated. For the first time since high school, I was facing rejection based on academic merit, and the old voices of doubt came flooding back. Maybe Mrs. Henderson had been partially right. Maybe I could achieve some success, but there were limits to how far someone like me could go. The rejection hit harder because Harvard had been my dream school. Their chemistry department was legendary, home to Nobel laureates and groundbreaking research. I'd imagined myself walking through their labs, contributing to discoveries that could change the world. Instead, I was holding evidence that even my MIT success wasn't enough. My mentor, Dr. Nakamura, found me in the lab that evening, staring dejectedly at my research notes. "I heard about Harvard," she said gently. "I'm sorry, Kristine, but you know this doesn't reflect your abilities, right?" "Maybe it does," I said, the words tasting bitter. "Maybe I've reached my ceiling. Maybe undergraduate research is as far as someone with my background can go." Dr. Nakamura sat down beside me, her expression serious. "Do you remember what you told me about your elementary school teacher? The one who said you'd never amount to anything?" I nodded, wondering where she was going with this. "You proved her spectacularly wrong. But now you're letting a single rejection letter do what years of special education? Placement couldn't make you doubt your own abilities." She was right, but the rejection still hurt. I'd grown so accustomed to academic success that this setback felt like confirmation of every fear I'd harbored about my limitations. "What are my other options?" I asked, trying to push past the disappointment. "Well, you could take a gap year and work in industry to gain more research experience. Some of the best chemists I know took unconventional paths to their peak." The idea of working in industry while my classmates went directly to graduate school felt like failure, but Dr. Nakamura helped me see it differently. "Think of it as an investment in your future. A year of real-world research experience will make you a stronger candidate and a better scientist." I spent weeks researching companies, finally accepting a position as a junior research chemist at Meridian Pharmaceuticals, a biotech company developing new cancer treatments. The work was challenging and meaningful, designing molecules that could target specific cancer cells while leaving healthy tissue unharmed. My supervisor, Dr. James Liu, was a Harvard PhD who'd left academia for industry. When I told him about my rejection, he laughed. "Harvard rejected me too, initially. Best thing that ever happened to my career. You learn different skills in industry: how to work under pressure, how to translate research into practical applications, how to collaborate with diverse teams." The work at Meridian was unlike anything I'd experienced in university labs. Instead of exploring fundamental chemical principles, we were racing against time to develop treatments that could save lives. The pressure was intense but exhilarating. Every synthesis attempt, every biological assay, every structure-activity relationship study brought us closer to potential therapies. I threw myself into the work with characteristic intensity, often staying late to run additional experiments or analyze unexpected results. My colleagues began to notice my contributions. "You have an unusual ability to see patterns in data," Dr. Liu told me during my 6-month review. "Most chemists focus on individual molecules, but you see the bigger picture, how small structural changes affect biological activity." My breakthrough came while working on a particularly challenging target, a protein involved in drug-resistant cancers. Previous attempts to design inhibitors had failed because the protein had no obvious binding pockets for small molecules. But studying the crystal structure, I noticed something others had missed: a transient cavity that appeared only when the protein underwent conformational changes. "What if we design a molecule that stabilizes this intermediate conformation?" I suggested during a team meeting, showing my computational models. Dr. Liu studied my proposal carefully. "That's brilliant thinking, Kristine. You're essentially proposing to drug an undruggable target by exploiting its dynamic behavior." The molecule I designed based on this insight showed remarkable activity in initial tests. Not only did it inhibit the target protein, but it did so with exquisite selectivity, avoiding the off-target effects that had plagued previous attempts. This could be a lead compound for an entirely new class of cancer drugs, Dr. Liu told me, as we reviewed the data. You've solved a problem that's stumped medicinal chemists for years. The discovery led to a patent application with my name as co-inventor and a paper in a high-impact journal. More importantly, it gave me confidence that my approach to chemistry, patterns and relationships that others missed was genuinely valuable. When I reapplied to graduate programs the following year, my application told a different story. Instead of just undergraduate research, I now had industry experience, a patent, and evidence that I could tackle real-world problems. The rejection letter from Harvard became part of my narrative, not as evidence of limitation, but as motivation. For growth this time, the acceptance letters poured in. Harvard, Stanford, Berkeley, Caltech, all the top programs wanted me. The rejection that had initially devastated me had actually strengthened my candidacy by forcing me to gain diverse experience. When I finally chose Harvard for my PhD, it felt like completing a circle. The rejection letter I'd kept as a reminder of temporary setback was now joined by an acceptance letter offering me a prestigious fellowship. Sometimes rejection is redirection, Dr. Liu told me on my last day at Meridian. You're going to make an exceptional graduate student because you understand both the fundamental science and its practical applications. As I prepared to leave for Cambridge, I reflected on how this temporary setback had actually accelerated my growth. The year in industry had taught me skills I never would have gained in traditional academic settings. I was entering graduate school not as a typical undergraduate, but as someone who'd already contributed to potentially life-saving research. The rejection letter remained in my files. No longer a source of pain, but a reminder that setbacks can become setups for greater success. Mrs. Henderson's prediction that I'd never amount to anything seemed more absurd than ever. As I prepared to begin doctoral studies at one of the world's most prestigious universities, the path hadn't been linear, but it had been perfect for shaping me into the scientist I was becoming. Harvard's chemistry building felt like a cathedral of science as I walked through its halls for the first time as a graduate student. The walls were lined with portraits of Nobel laureates. He was my new advisor, a quantum chemist whose work on molecular dynamics had revolutionized how we understand chemical reactions at the atomic level. "Welcome to Harvard, Kristine," Dr. Harrison said, gesturing for me to sit in his book-filled office. "I've read your work from Meridian, exceptional insight into protein dynamics. I think you'll find our research group stimulating." My PhD project would focus on developing new computational methods to predict how molecules behave during chemical reactions, work that combined quantum mechanics, statistical mechanics, and advanced mathematics. It was exactly the kind of fundamental research I'd dreamed of pursuing, yet terrifyingly complex. The first year of graduate school was brutal. 20-hour days spent mastering quantum chemical theory, learning advanced programming languages, and taking graduate courses that assumed knowledge I was still acquiring. My dyslexia made the dense theoretical texts particularly challenging, but I'd learned to compensate by creating visual representations of abstract concepts, while my classmates seemed to absorb information effortlessly. I had to work twice as hard to process the same material. Late nights in the library became my norm, using audio recordings and specialized software to help me navigate through papers on density. Was happening as I struggled through the coursework. The same visual thinking that had made reading difficult was giving me unique insights into molecular behavior. I could see electron density distributions in my mind, visualize how molecular orbitals overlapped during bond formation, understand how quantum mechanical effects influenced reaction pathways. My breakthrough came during my second year, while working on a particularly challenging problem, predicting the reaction rates of organic molecules in solution. Traditional computational methods failed because they couldn't account for the complex ways that solvent molecules influenced the reacting species. "The problem is that we're treating solvent as a static background," I explained to Dr. Harrison during one of our weekly meetings. "But in reality, solvent molecules are constantly moving, creating, and destroying temporary environments around the reactants." "That's true," he agreed. "But modeling those dynamic effects requires computational resources we don't have. The calculations would take decades to complete." Notebook. Developing a new approach that combines statistical sampling with quantum mechanical calculations? What if we don't try to model every solvent molecule explicitly? What if we identify the most important solvent configurations and focus our computational effort there? Dr. Harrison leaned forward, intrigued. "Go on." I showed him my preliminary calculations, demonstrating how my method could capture the essential physics of solvation while reducing computational cost by factors of thousands. It was a theoretical breakthrough that could make previously impossible calculations routine. "Is brilliant, Kristine," he said, studying my equations. You've found a way to solve one of the fundamental problems in computational chemistry. This could be the foundation for your dissertation. The next 3 years were a whirlwind of research, discovery, and growth. My method, which I called dynamic salvation density functional theory, proved remarkably successful at predicting experimental results. Other research groups began requesting my software in ways I hadn't anticipated. Developing new theory required not just understanding existing science, but pushing beyond current knowledge into uncharted territory. There were months when nothing worked, when my calculations produced nonsensical results, when I questioned whether my ideas were fundamentally flawed. During these dark periods, Mrs. Henderson's voice would resurface. You'll never amount to anything. The difference now was that I had evidence to counter that voice: published papers, successful predictions, recognition from the scientific community, but the self-doubt still lingered, especially during the inevitable failures that accompany cutting-edge research. The most challenging moment came during my 4th year when a competing research group published a paper that seemed to invalidate my approach. Their calculations suggested that my method contained fundamental errors, that the insights I'd gained were artifacts of computational mistakes. I spent 3 weeks checking and rechecking my work. The possibility that my entire thesis was based on flawed reasoning kept me awake at night. I considered switching to a different project, abandoning years of work to pursue something safer. But Dr. Harrison encouraged me to dig deeper. Science is about understanding truth, not just publishing papers, he told me. If there's an error in your method, we need to find it. If there's an error in theirs, we need to demonstrate it. After careful analysis, I discovered that the competing group had made a subtle but crucial approximation that invalidated their conclusions. My method was correct, but only under specific conditions that I hadn't fully characterized. To a refined theory that was more robust and widely applicable, the correction resulted in a high-impact publication that not only validated my approach, but extended its scope significantly. The paper became one of the most cited works in computational chemistry that year, establishing me as a rising star in the field. Writing my dissertation was both exhausting and exhilarating. Quantum chemical analysis of molecular interactions. New methods for understanding chemical reactivity in solution represented 5 years of intensive work. But more than that, it represented the culmination of a journey that had begun with Mrs. Henderson's devastating prediction. The document itself became my most important artifact. 400 pages of equations, calculations, and insights that constituted an original contribution to human knowledge. The girl who had been labeled mentally deficient had just completed one of the most intellectually demanding endeavors possible, a PhD in theoretical chemistry from Harvard University. My dissertation defense was scheduled for a warm May afternoon, with 5 distinguished professors serving as my examining committee. As I prepared my presentation, I thought about all the people who had shaped my journey: Mrs. Henderson with her cruel dismissal, Grandma Rose with her encouraging chemistry set, Dr. Nakamura with her research opportunities, and Dr. Harrison with his mentorship. Standing at the podium, looking out at the committee and audience, I felt the weight of everything that had brought me to this moment. In 30 minutes, I would either earn my PhD or face the possibility that even Harvard's rigorous training hadn't been enough to overcome my supposed limitations. But as I began my presentation, explaining how molecular interactions could be understood through quantum mechanical principles, I felt confidence replace anxiety. This was my life's work, my contribution to the scientific enterprise that had fascinated me since childhood. Presentation: your work represents a significant advance in computational chemistry. Congratulations on a successful defense, Dr. Walters. For the first time in my life, I was addressed by the title that represented the highest level of academic achievement. Fresh out of Harvard with my PhD, I faced the next crucial step in an academic career: the postdoctoral fellowship. This stage would determine whether I could transition from promising graduate student to independent researcher capable of leading my own laboratory. The competition was fierce: hundreds of newly minted PhDs competing for positions with the world's most distinguished scientists. I applied to 15 top-tier research groups, from Stanford to Cambridge, from ETH Zurich to the University of Tokyo. My goal was to work with Professor Alina Kowalski at UC Berkeley, whose lab was pioneering the use of artificial intelligence to accelerate chemical discovery. Her work represented the cutting edge of computational chemistry, exactly where I wanted to position myself for the future. The acceptance to Berkeley came with a prestigious fellowship, but also with the knowledge that I'd be working alongside some of the brightest minds in chemistry. During my first week, I attended a group meeting where postdocs casually discussed research that would have been cutting edge just years earlier. The intellectual bar was higher than anything I'd previously experienced. Professor Kowalski assigned me an ambitious project: developing machine learning algorithms that could predict the properties of molecules that had never been synthesized. It was a moonshot idea using artificial intelligence to essentially see into the future of chemistry, identifying promising compounds before anyone had bothered to make them. The challenge, Professor Kowalski explained during our first one-on-one meeting, is that traditional computational methods are too slow for screening millions of potential molecules. We need AI that can learn the underlying patterns of molecular behavior and make accurate predictions in seconds rather than days. I threw myself into the work with characteristic intensity, spending months learning machine learning theory, studying neural network architectures, and developing algorithms that could process molecular data. The learning curve was steep, was essentially acquiring expertise in a completely new field, while trying to push the boundaries of what was possible. But 6 months into my postdoc, disaster struck. The National Science Foundation rejected my grant application for continued funding of the project. The review comments were devastating. While ambitious, the proposed research is premature. Current AI methods are insufficient for reliable molecular property prediction. The applicant should focus on more achievable goals. The rejection letter became another painful artifact in my collection. This wasn't just personal disappointment, it threatened the entire direction of my research. Without funding, I couldn't afford the computational resources necessary for training sophisticated AI models. The project that was supposed to establish my scientific independence was dead in the water. Professor Kowalski called me into her office the day after the rejection arrived. I know this is disappointing, Kristine, but funding rejections are part of academic life. The question is, do you believe in your approach enough to find another way forward? I spent sleepless nights considering my options. I could switch to a safer project with more predictable outcomes, something that funding agencies would be more likely to support. Or I could find a way to continue pursuing the high-risk, high-reward research that excited me most. The solution came from an unexpected source. While lamenting my funding woes to my old supervisor, Dr. Liu, at Meridian Pharmaceuticals, he made an intriguing offer. What if we provided computational resources in exchange for access to your algorithms? We're desperate for better ways to predict drug properties before we spend millions on synthesis and testing. It was an unusual arrangement to postdoc collaborating directly with industry, but Professor Kowalski supported the partnership. Good. Science should serve practical needs, she said. If your algorithms can help develop better medicines, that's worth more than any grant. Working with Meridian gave me access to massive datasets of molecular structures and properties, along with the computational power needed to train sophisticated AI models. But it also meant working under the pressure of real-world deadlines and expectations. Pharmaceutical companies don't have the luxury of pursuing interesting but impractical research. They need results that translate into better drugs. The breakthrough came after 18 months of intensive work. I'd developed a neural network architecture that could predict molecular properties with unprecedented accuracy, learning from millions of known compounds to make reliable predictions about completely novel structures. When we tested the algorithm on Meridian's database of experimental compounds, it achieved prediction accuracies that amazed even seasoned medicinal chemists. This is revolutionary, Dr. Liu told me as we reviewed the validation results. Your algorithm can predict bioactivity better than our most experienced scientists. This could transform how we discover new medicines. The success led to a flurry of activity. Meridian licensed my algorithms, providing royalty payments that made me financially independent for the first time in my life. Other pharmaceutical companies began requesting access to the technology. Academic groups wanted to collaborate on extending the methods to new applications, but perhaps most satisfying was resubmitting my grant application to NSF the following year. This time, instead of speculative theories, I had proof of concept working algorithms that had been validated in real-world applications. The same program officer who had rejected my initial application now praised the groundbreaking insights, an exceptional potential for broad impact. The funding approval came with a note from the review panel. This represents exactly the kind of innovative, high-risk research that NSF should support. Dr. Walters has demonstrated exceptional creativity and perseverance in developing new approaches to molecular discovery. Reading those words, I thought about Mrs. Henderson's prediction that I would never amount to anything. Here I was, having developed technology that could accelerate the discovery of life-saving medicines, receiving recognition from the nation's premier scientific funding agency for innovative research. The rejected grant application remained in my files as a reminder that even valid scientific ideas aren't always accepted immediately. Sometimes breakthrough research requires not just good science but persistence, creativity in finding resources, and willingness to take unconventional paths. My postdoc years taught me that academic success isn't just about intellectual ability. about resilience, adaptability, and the courage to pursue ambitious goals despite inevitable setbacks. The funding rejection that had initially devastated me actually led to a more impactful outcome than I'd originally planned. As my postdoc neared its end, I began applying for faculty positions at major universities. My CV now included not just publications and awards, but patent applications, industry collaborations, and evidence that my research could create real-world value. I was no longer just a promising young scientist. I was someone who had proven the ability to translate innovative ideas into practical solutions. The job interviews were intense, but I faced them with confidence earned through overcoming obstacles. When search committees asked about my resilience and problem-solving abilities, I could point to concrete examples of turning setbacks into opportunities, of finding creative solutions when conventional approaches failed. The little girl who had struggled to read in Mrs. Henderson's classroom was now positioned to become a professor at a major research university, ready to train the next generation of scientists while continuing to push the boundaries of what was possible in chemical discovery. The discovery that would eventually lead to my Nobel Prize began during a late night in my Berkeley lab, 3 years into my postdoc. It was 2:30 a.m. on a Tuesday in October, and I was the only person left in the building, hunched over my computer, analyzing the latest results from my molecular prediction algorithms. The custodial staff had long since finished their rounds, leaving me alone with the hum of computational servers and the soft glow of multiple monitors. I'd been troubleshooting a persistent anomaly in my AI models for weeks. When predicting the properties of certain organic molecules, my algorithms consistently produced results that seemed impossible. Compounds that should have been highly reactive were predicted to be remarkably stable. While supposedly stable, molecules appeared to be prone to unexpected decomposition. Initially, I'd assumed these were computational errors, artifacts of insufficient training data, or flawed neural network architectures. But as I dug deeper into the specific molecular structures triggering these anomalies, I began to notice a pattern that made my pulse quicken with excitement. All the problematic molecules shared a common structural feature, a specific arrangement of atoms that created what I began to think of as a quantum bridge, a configuration where electrons could tunnel between different parts of the molecule in ways that classical chemistry couldn't explain. The effects were subtle, invisible to conventional analytical methods, but profound in their implications for molecular behavior. I grabbed my lab notebook, the same type of bound composition book I'd used since graduate school, and began sketching molecular structures, writing equations, and documenting the theoretical framework that was emerging in my mind. The pages filled rapidly with diagrams showing electron density distributions, quantum mechanical calculations, and predictions about how these mysterious interactions might influence chemical reactivity. This can't be right, I muttered to myself, checking and rechecking my calculations, but every analysis pointed to the same conclusion. I was observing a previously unknown quantum mechanical effect that governed how certain molecules behaved at the atomic level. The implications were staggering. If my theory was correct, chemists had been missing a fundamental aspect of molecular behavior for decades. Reactions that seemed random or unpredictable might actually follow precise quantum mechanical rules that we'd simply never recognized. Drug molecules might be more or less effective than expected, based on quantum effects we'd never considered. I worked until dawn, my notebook filling with increasingly detailed theoretical predictions. By 6 a.m., I had the outline of a new framework for understanding molecular quantum mechanics, what I would eventually call coherent molecular quantum dynamics, or CMQD theory. But having a theory was only the beginning. Science demands validation, and the effects I was predicting were so subtle that they'd require extraordinarily precise measurements to detect. I needed to design experiments that could prove my quantum bridge hypothesis wasn't just computational fantasy. The challenge was that the quantum effects I was predicting occurred on timescales of femtoseconds, quadrillionths of a second, and involved energy differences smaller than the thermal noise at room temperature. Measuring such phenomena would require the most advanced experimental techniques available. I spent weeks designing collaborative experiments with Professor Maria Santos at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, whose group had access to the world's most sophisticated ultrafast laser systems. We developed a protocol using attosecond spectroscopy, a technique so precise it could track the motion of individual electrons during chemical reactions. "You're asking us to measure something that most people believe doesn't exist," Professor Santos told me as we planned the experiments. "Are you sure about this theory?" "No," I admitted. "But if I'm right, we're about to revolutionize how we understand chemistry at the molecular level." The experiments took months to set up and weeks to execute. We needed conditions so precisely controlled that the slightest vibration or temperature fluctuation could invalidate our results. Each measurement required focusing laser pulses lasting attosecons onto individual molecules, while simultaneously detecting the quantum mechanical signals I'd predicted. The night we collected our first definitive data, I barely slept. Professor Santos called me at 6 a.m. with results that made my hands shake as I held the phone. "Kristine, you were right. We're seeing exactly the quantum coherence effects your theory predicted. The electron tunneling, the energy transfer pathways, the stability modifications, everything matches your calculations." I raced to the lab to see the data myself. The spectroscopic signatures were unmistakable. Clear evidence of quantum mechanical effects that had never been observed in chemical systems. Molecules were indeed communicating through quantum bridges, exchanging energy and information in ways that classical chemistry couldn't explain. My laboratory notebook from that period became the most important artifact of my scientific career. Page after page of equations, molecular diagrams, and theoretical insights that documented the birth of a new field. The notebook contained the original derivations of CMQD theory, the experimental designs that proved its validity, and the calculations that would eventually transform multiple areas of chemistry. But perhaps most importantly, those pages captured the intellectual journey from observation to understanding, the process of questioning assumptions, developing new theoretical frameworks, and designing experiments to test radical hypotheses. It was pure science at its most fundamental level. The discovery process wasn't just about the final result. It was about learning to trust my scientific intuition even when it contradicted conventional wisdom. Years of being told I couldn't think properly had actually taught me to think differently, to see patterns and connections that others missed because they weren't looking for them. As I documented our experimental validation of CMQD theory, I thought about Mrs. Henderson's assessment that I lacked the intellectual capacity for abstract thinking. The irony was profound. The same brain she'd labeled as deficient had just uncovered fundamental principles governing molecular behavior that had eluded chemists for generations. The notebook pages filled with increasingly sophisticated theoretical developments as I extended CMQD theory to predict new phenomena, design novel experiments, and explore applications in everything from drug design to renewable energy. Each page represented not just scientific progress, but personal vindication of abilities that had been systematically underestimated. Late at night in the lab, surrounded by the equipment that had revealed nature's quantum secrets, I often reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. The little girl who'd struggled with reading had grown into a scientist capable of reading the universe's most subtle signals. The breakthrough discovery documented in my laboratory notebook would soon change how chemists understood their field. But it had already changed how I understood myself, not as someone limited by early struggles, but as someone uniquely positioned to see what others couldn't. The publication of our CMQD theory in Nature created an immediate sensation in the chemistry community. Within weeks of its release, my email inbox was flooded with requests from researchers around the world wanting to collaborate, apply the theory to their systems, or simply understand the implications of this new framework for molecular behavior. But it was the job offer from the University of Chicago that truly marked my transition from promising postdoc to rising star. Professor Jonathan Hayes, the department chair, called me personally with an offer that seemed too good to be true. "Dr. Walters, we'd like to offer you a position as associate professor with tenure track," he said, his voice carrying genuine excitement. "Your CMQD work represents the kind of paradigm-shifting research we want to support. We're prepared to offer you a substantial startup package, state-of-the-art computational facilities, and the resources to build a world-class research program." The offer letter became another treasured artifact, official recognition that I'd achieved what once seemed impossible. The University of Chicago wasn't just offering me a job. They were betting their reputation on my ability to continue producing groundbreaking science. Moving to Chicago felt like stepping into a new phase of my life. No longer was I working under someone else's direction. I was now responsible for charting my own research course, recruiting students, securing funding, and building a scientific legacy. The freedom was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. My first priority was establishing a research group. I carefully selected graduate students and postdocs who shared my passion for pushing boundaries, for asking questions that others considered too risky or too ambitious. Within 6 months, the Walters Lab had 12 members working on extending CMQD theory to new applications. The work progressed rapidly. My team developed computational tools that could predict quantum effects in pharmaceutical compounds, leading to collaborations with major drug companies. We extended the theory to understand energy transfer in solar cells, opening new avenues for renewable energy research. Each application revealed new aspects of quantum molecular behavior that had been invisible to conventional approaches. The recognition came in waves. First, the American Chemical Society's Award for Pure Chemistry, recognizing groundbreaking contributions to understanding quantum effects in molecular systems. Then the prestigious MacArthur Fellowship, the so-called Genius Grant, which provided 5 years of unrestricted funding for my research. But perhaps most meaningful was the invitation to deliver the Pauling Lecture at Caltech, named after the only person to win both Nobel Prizes in chemistry and the Peace Prize. Standing at the same podium where Linus Pauling had once shared his insights about chemical bonding, I felt the weight of scientific history. Ladies and gentlemen, I began my lecture. I want to tell you about a discovery that started with computational anomalies and led to a fundamental revision of how we understand molecular behavior. As I presented CMQD theory to an audience of distinguished chemists, I thought about Mrs. Henderson sitting somewhere, perhaps watching on livestream, finally understanding how spectacularly wrong her assessment had been. The media attention was unprecedented for theoretical chemistry. Science journalists called CMQD theory the discovery that rewrote chemistry textbooks. Popular science magazines featured my work, explaining how quantum effects could revolutionize everything from medicine to materials science. But with recognition came pressure. Every new paper I published was scrutinized intensely, analyzed for signs that my early success might have been lucky rather than sustainable. The stakes felt enormous, not just for my career, but for the entire field I was helping to create. The breakthrough that cemented my reputation came during my 3rd year. At Chicago, working with my postdoc, Dr. Jennifer Kim, we discovered that CMQD effects could be harnessed to design molecular switches, compounds that could change their properties in response to specific stimuli with unprecedented precision and speed. Professor Walters, look at these results, Dr. Kim said, bursting into my office with printouts of our latest calculations. The molecular switch we designed shows perfect selectivity. It responds only to the specific biological target we want, ignoring everything else. I studied the data, my excitement growing as I realized the implications. We hadn't just designed a molecular switch, we'd created a new class of smart materials that could revolutionize medicine, electronics, and countless other applications. The molecular switch work led to a flurry of patent applications and licensing agreements. Pharmaceutical companies wanted to use our designs for targeted drug delivery. Electronics manufacturers saw applications in quantum computing. Materials scientists envisioned smart polymers that could adapt to their environment. International invitations began pouring in. The Royal Society of London elected me as a foreign member, one of the youngest scientists ever to receive this honor. The Japanese Society for the Promotion of Science invited me for an extended residency. Universities across Europe and Asia made offers to establish satellite labs or joint research programs, but perhaps most surprisingly, I began receiving inquiries about potential Nobel Prize nominations. Colleagues would mention it casually, almost as if discussing an inevitable development rather than a remote possibility. When you win the Nobel, they'd say, not if. The idea seemed surreal. The Nobel Prize represented the pinnacle of scientific achievement, recognition reserved for discoveries that fundamentally changed human understanding. Could my work on quantum molecular dynamics really be significant enough to warrant such consideration? Late at night in my Chicago office, reviewing the papers that had emerged from our research program, I began to see the bigger picture. CMQ theory hadn't just explained some computational anomalies, it had opened entirely new fields of research. Hundreds of scientists were now working on applications of quantum molecular effects, from drug design to renewable energy to quantum computing. The little girl who'd been told she'd never amount to anything had created a scientific framework that was reshaping multiple disciplines. The brain that Mrs. Henderson had labeled as deficient was generating insights that were advancing human knowledge and potentially improving countless lives. But even as recognition accumulated, I remained focused on the science itself. Awards and honors were gratifying, but the real reward was the daily excitement of discovery, the thrill of understanding nature's secrets, the satisfaction of mentoring young scientists who would push our field even further. The University of Chicago job offer letter remained framed in my office, but it was now surrounded by evidence of everything that had followed: awards, honors, patents, and most importantly, the grateful letters from students whose careers I'd helped launch, and patients whose lives had been improved by drugs designed using our quantum molecular principles. Mrs. Henderson's prediction was becoming more absurd with each passing year, but it also remained a source of motivation. Every breakthrough was proof that potential can't be contained by other people's limited vision. that the human capacity for discovery is far greater than any single assessment can capture. The call came on a Tuesday morning in February, as I was reviewing grant applications in my Chicago office. Professor Erik Lindahl from the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm spoke with the formal precision that characterized all official Nobel Committee communications. Dr. Walters, I am calling to inform you that you have been nominated for the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for your discovery and development of coherent molecular quantum dynamics theory. I must emphasize that this information is strictly confidential and cannot be shared with anyone for 50 years, as per Nobel Committee protocols. I sat in stunned silence, the phone feeling impossibly heavy in my hand. A Nobel nomination. The possibility had been whispered about in academic circles for months, but hearing it spoken officially felt surreal. The girl who had once been labeled mentally deficient was now being considered for the highest honor in science. Dr. Walters, are you there? Yes, I'm sorry, I managed. This is unexpected. What happens now? Professor Lindahl explained the process with clinical precision. My nomination would be evaluated alongside hundreds of others by expert committees. The deliberations would take months, involving detailed reviews of my scientific contributions, their impact on the field, and their potential benefit to humanity. The winner would be announced in early October. I can tell you that your nomination is particularly strong, he added. CMQD theory has generated over 3,000 citations in just 5 years, and its applications span multiple disciplines. The committee recognizes this as truly transformative science. After hanging up, I sat motionless for several minutes, staring at the confidential nomination letter that had arrived by secure courier the same morning. The document was elegantly simpler. Few paragraphs on Nobel Committee letterhead, confirming what Professor Lindahl had just told me. But the weight of its implications was enormous. The secrecy was perhaps the most challenging aspect. I couldn't share this news with my parents, my colleagues, or even my closest friends. The excitement and anxiety had to be contained, processed privately while maintaining normal research activities and public appearances. But keeping the secret became increasingly difficult as the months progressed. Colleagues began making comments that suggested rumors were circulating in the scientific community. Big year for quantum chemistry, Professor Henderson mentioned during a conference call, his tone suggesting he knew more than he was saying. Could be historic announcements coming. The waiting was agonizing. Every day brought the possibility of life-changing news. Yet I had to continue normal activities, teaching classes, supervising students, reviewing papers, attending conferences. The cognitive dissonance of potentially being months away from the Nobel Prize while grading undergraduate exams was almost absurd. I threw myself into work with even greater intensity, partly as distraction and partly from a superstitious fear that reducing my scientific output might somehow influence the committee's decision. My research group noticed my increased focus, though they attributed it to my naturally driven personality rather than the secret I was carrying. The breakthrough that summer felt particularly poignant. Working with my graduate student Marcus Chen, we discovered how to use CMQD principles to design molecular sensors that could detect single cancer cells in blood samples. The potential for early cancer diagnosis was revolutionary, representing exactly the kind of humanitarian application that Nobel committees valued. Professor Walters, these results are incredible, Marcus said as we analyzed the data. We're looking at sensitivity levels that are orders of magnitude better than existing methods. This could save millions of lives. I smiled, thinking about how Mrs. Henderson's prediction that I'd never amount to anything contrasted with work that might prevent countless deaths from cancer. But I also felt the weight of the nomination secret, the knowledge that this discovery might be evaluated. As part of my Nobel candidacy, the summer research conference circuit was particularly surreal. At the International Symposium on Quantum Chemistry in Vienna, I delivered a plenary lecture to 2,000 attendees, knowing that some of them might be involved in the Nobel evaluation process. Every question felt loaded with additional significance, every interaction potentially relevant to my candidacy. Dr. Walters, a senior chemist from the Max Planck Institute, approached me after my talk. Your work has truly revolutionized our field. The applications seem limitless. His smile suggested he might know more than his words revealed. The most difficult moment came during a family dinner in September. My mother was proudly telling relatives about my recent awards and recognition, speculating about what honors might come next. Maybe one day she'll even win the Nobel Prize, she said, her voice filled with maternal pride. Can you imagine? Our Kristine, who they said would never amount to anything, winning the most prestigious award in science? I managed to smile and deflect the conversation, but inside I was screaming with the need to share what I knew. The possibility that her speculation might become reality within weeks was almost too much to bear. The final month of waiting was the most intense. October announcements were imminent, and every phone call, every unexpected email, every knock on my office door made my heart race. I found myself checking the Nobel Committee website obsessively, even though I knew the announcement date wouldn't change. Sleep became elusive. I would lie awake calculating probabilities, analyzing the competition, wondering whether my contributions were truly worthy of Nobel recognition. The work felt significant to me, but did it meet the impossibly high standards set by previous laureates? My students and colleagues noticed my nervous energy but attributed it to normal academic stress. Professor Walters seems extra intense lately. I overheard one graduate student mention to another, maybe she's working on something really big. If only they knew how big it might actually be. The nomination letter remained locked in my office. Safe. A tangible reminder of the possibility that had been consuming my thoughts for months. Sometimes I would take it out and reread it, still hardly believing that my name was being considered alongside the greatest scientists in history. Mrs. Henderson's voice had been notably quiet during these months, perhaps finally silenced by the magnitude of what I had achieved. The girl she had dismissed as cognitively deficient was now potentially weeks away from receiving the highest recognition that science could bestow. As October approached, bringing with it the announcement that would either validate my life's work or consign this nomination to historical footnote, I reflected on the improbable journey that had brought me to this moment. From special education placement to potential Nobel laureate, it seemed impossible. Yet here I was, carrying the secret that could soon transform how the world saw both my work and my worth. October 5th arrived with an unseasonable chill in Chicago, and I woke at 4 a.m. unable to return to sleep. Today was the day. The Nobel Committee in Stockholm would announce this year's chemistry prize, and somewhere in Sweden, a small group of distinguished scientists had already made their decision about whether my life's work merited the highest honor in science. I made coffee with shaking hands and sat in my kitchen, staring at my phone. The announcement was scheduled for 11:45 a.m. Stockholm time, 4:45 a.m. in Chicago. In 45 minutes, I would either receive the call that would change everything, or I would learn that this nomination, like so many before it, had not resulted. In the ultimate recognition, my landline and cell phone were both charged and placed on the kitchen counter. The Nobel Committee had specific protocols for contacting laureates, and I'd been warned that they would try multiple numbers to ensure they could reach me before the public announcement at 4:30 a.m. I paced through my apartment, unable to sit still. 15 minutes felt like hours. I thought about Mrs. Henderson, probably asleep in her bed somewhere, completely unaware that her former student was potentially minutes away from winning the Nobel Prize. The irony was delicious and terrifying. In equal measure, 4:40 a.m., my hands were sweating despite the cool morning air. I'd worked my entire career for this moment, yet now that it was here, I felt utterly unprepared. How does one prepare to potentially receive the most prestigious award in science? 4:43 a.m. The silence in my apartment was deafening. Every small sound, the refrigerator humming, a car passing outside, the building settling seemed amplified. I checked my phones again, making sure they were working, that the volume was turned up, that I hadn't somehow missed a call. At exactly 4:45 a.m., my landline rang. I stared at it for 2 rings, my heart hammering against my ribs. This was it. This call would either fulfill my greatest scientific dream or dash hopes I'd been nurturing for months. Hello? My voice came out as barely a whisper. Dr. Kristine Walters. Yes, this is Dr. Walters. This is Professor Gran Hansen, Secretary General of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. It is my great honor to inform you that you have been awarded the 2024 Nobel Prize in Chemistry for your discovery and development of coherent molecular quantum dynamics theory and its applications to understanding molecular behavior at the quantum level. The words hit me like a physical force. I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair, the phone pressed to my ear, trying to process what I'd just heard. The Nobel Prize. I had won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry. Dr. Walters, are you there? Yes, I'm here. I'm sorry. This is ... This is incredible. I'm honored beyond words. Professor Hansen's voice was warm with genuine pleasure. Your work has revolutionized our understanding of molecular quantum mechanics and opened entirely new fields of research. The committee was unanimous in recognizing the extraordinary significance of your contributions to chemistry and their potential to benefit humanity. He explained the next steps. The official announcement would be made public in 1 hour, giving me time to inform my immediate family. The formal ceremony would be held in Stockholm on December 10th, the anniversary of Alfred Nobel's death. I would receive a medal, a diploma, and prize money of approximately $1 million, After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen in stunned silence. The Nobel Prize, the highest honor in science. The recognition that placed me among the most distinguished scientists in human history: Marie Curie, Linus Pauling, Dorothy Hodgkin, and now, impossibly, Kristine Walters. The first call I made was to my parents. My mother answered on the second ring, instantly alert despite the early hour. "Kristine, what's wrong? Why are you calling so early?" "Mom, I have news, incredible news. I just won the Nobel Prize." Silence. Then my mother's sharp intake of breath. "The Nobel Prize? The actual Nobel Prize?" "Yes, Mom. The Nobel Prize in chemistry? They just called to tell me." I heard her calling to my father, her voice breaking with emotion. Frank, wake up. Kristine won the Nobel Prize." Then she was back on the phone, crying openly. "Oh, sweetheart, I'm so proud of you. I can't believe it. Our daughter, the Nobel laureate?" My father's voice joined the call, thick with sleep and disbelief. "The Nobel Prize? Are you sure? This isn't some kind of mistake." "I'm sure, Dad. The Secretary General of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences just called personally. It's real." What followed was 15 minutes of tears, laughter, and disbelief. My parents, who had once sat through Mrs. Henderson's devastating assessment of my potential, were now the parents of a Nobel Prize winner. The transformation seemed impossible, yet here we were at exactly 5:45 a.m. Chicago time. The official announcement was released to the global media. My phone immediately began ringing with calls from colleagues, journalists, and university administrators. The Nobel Committee had provided a recording of the official announcement, and I listened to it in wonder. The Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences has decided to award the 2024 Nobel Prize in Chemistry to Dr. Kristine Walters of the University of Chicago for her discovery and development of coherent molecular quantum dynamics theory. This groundbreaking work has revolutionized our understanding of how quantum effects govern molecular behavior and has enabled the development of new approaches to drug design, materials, science, and renewable energy. The recording became another precious artifact, capturing the moment when my life's work received the ultimate scientific validation. I saved it to my computer, knowing I would listen to it many times in the years to come, still hardly believing that those words referred to me. The media response was immediate and overwhelming. Within an hour, reporters were calling my university requesting interviews. Science journalists wanted to understand the implications of CMQD theory for their readers. Television producers were planning special segments on the youngest woman to win the chemistry Nobel in decades, but perhaps the most meaningful response came from my students and colleagues. Dr. Kim, my former postdoc, called crying with joy. Marcus Chen, my graduate student, sent a text that simply said, "We did it, Professor, Nobel laureate." The members of my research group gathered in the lab, cheering and taking photos with printouts of the Nobel announcement. Dr. Harrison, my PhD advisor, called from Harvard with pride evident in his voice. "I always knew you were destined for greatness, Kristine. This is the culmination of everything you've worked toward." But the call that moved me most came from Grandma Rose, now 89 and in assisted living, but still sharp as ever. I told them, "You had the mind of a scientist," she said, her voice strong despite her age. "That chemistry set was the best investment I ever made." As the morning progressed and the reality of winning the Nobel Prize began to sink in, I found myself thinking repeatedly about Mrs. Henderson. Somewhere she was probably learning that her former student, the girl she'd labeled as mentally deficient, the child she'd said would never amount to anything, had just won the most prestigious award in science. The Nobel Prize represented more than professional recognition. It was vindication of every student who had ever been underestimated, proof that potential can't be contained by other people's limited vision, and evidence that the human capacity for discovery is far greater than any single assessment can capture. I was now Dr. Kristine Walters, Nobel laureate in chemistry. The transformation was complete, but the journey was far from over. The weeks following the Nobel announcement passed in a blur of interviews, congratulations, and preparations for the December ceremony in Stockholm. My quiet academic life had been replaced by a whirlwind of media attention, speaking engagements, and the surreal experience of being introduced as Nobel laureate Dr. Kristine Walters everywhere. I went. But perhaps the most meaningful task was preparing my Nobel lecture. Their work to the scientific community and the world. The lecture would be delivered at the Karolinska Institute on December 8th, 2 days before the formal prize ceremony, and would be attended by fellow Nobel laureates, distinguished scientists, and global media. I spent countless hours crafting every word, Knowing that this speech would define how my scientific legacy would be remembered, the lecture needed to explain CMQD theory to experts while remaining accessible to the general public, demonstrate its significance for advancing human knowledge, and convey the excitement of scientific discovery. But as I worked on the presentation, I kept returning to a deeper story, the journey from a struggling child, labeled as deficient, to a scientist at the pinnacle of her field. This wasn't just about molecular quantum mechanics, it was about the power of persistence, the danger of limiting expectations, and the importance of recognizing potential even when it's hidden beneath surface struggles. My lecture notes became another treasured artifact covered with revisions, margin notes, and the careful crafting of words that would capture both the scientific significance of my work and its personal meaning. The opening paragraph went through dozens of iterations before I found the right tone. Your Majesties, distinguished colleagues, and friends. Today, I want to tell you about a discovery that began with computational anomalies and led to a fundamental revision of how we understand molecular behavior. But more than that, I want to share what this journey has taught me about the nature of scientific inquiry, the importance of persistence, and the extraordinary things that become possible when we refuse to accept limitations imposed by others. The scientific content of the lecture was meticulously detailed explanations of quantum coherence effects, demonstrations of CMQD applications, and visions for future research directions. But woven throughout was a more personal narrative about overcoming obstacles, finding mentors who believed in potential rather than labels, and discovering that different ways of thinking could lead to unique insights. I practiced the lecture dozens of times in front of mirrors, colleagues, and video cameras. The University of Chicago provided media training to help me handle the intense international attention. Every gesture, every transition, every explanation was refined until the presentation felt both natural and precisely calibrated. The most challenging section dealt with the humanitarian applications of CMQD theory. I wanted to emphasize how fundamental scientific research, even the most abstract theoretical work, could ultimately benefit human welfare. The molecular sensors we'd developed for early cancer detection, the drug design principles that were accelerating pharmaceutical development, the renewable energy applications, all of these practical benefits had emerged from curiosity-driven research into quantum molecular behavior. Science, I plan to say, is ultimately about expanding human capability. Every equation we derive, every phenomenon we explain, every theory we develop contributes to our collective ability to understand and improve our world. The quantum effects that govern molecular behavior aren't just abstract curiosities, they're tools for creating a better future. As December approached, the reality of the Stockholm ceremony began to feel overwhelming. I would be walking in the footsteps of Marie Curie, Albert Einstein, and Dorothy Hodgkin. The formal banquet would be attended by the Swedish royal family, with coverage broadcast to millions of viewers worldwide. The medal I would receive had been designed by Eric Lindbergh in 1902 and represented the highest honor that science could bestow. My parents, now in their 70s, were making their first trip to Europe to attend the ceremony. The pride in their voices during our planning conversations was almost palpable. Our daughter, receiving a Nobel Prize from the King of Sweden, my mother kept repeating, as if saying it aloud would make it feel more real. But perhaps the most poignant moment came when I was selecting guests for the ceremony. Allows laureates to invite a limited number of family members and close friends, and I found myself thinking about all the people who had shaped my journey. Grandma Rose, now 89, was determined to attend despite her age. I wouldn't miss this for anything, she said firmly. I want to see what that chemistry set accomplished. Dr. Nakamura from MIT, Dr. Harrison from Harvard, Professor Kowalski from Berkeley, of the mentors who had seen potential when others saw only problems. I also thought about inviting Mrs. Henderson. The idea was both appealing and terrifying, the ultimate demonstration that her assessment had been wrong, but also a gesture of forgiveness and understanding. After much consideration, I decided against it. This ceremony was about celebration, not vindication, and I didn't want the occasion clouded by past wounds that had already healed. The media interviews leading up to Stockholm were intense, but rewarding. Reporters wanted to understand not just the science, but the personal story behind it. When a journalist from Science magazine asked about overcoming early academic struggles, I found myself thinking carefully about how to frame the narrative. I don't think of my journey as overcoming disabilities or limitations, I said. I think of it as discovering that there are many different ways to be intelligent, many different paths to understanding. The real tragedy isn't struggling with reading or being different. It's when we let those differences convince us that we're not capable of achieving our dreams. The weeks of preparation culminated in packing for Stockholm. Along with formal attire for the ceremony and banquet, I carefully packed my Nobel lecture notes, the original laboratory notebook containing my CMQD discoveries, and a small framed photo of 8-year-old me with my first chemistry set. A reminder of how far the journey had taken me. As I boarded the plane to Sweden, I reflected on the extraordinary sequence of events that had brought me to this moment. From Mrs. Henderson's crushing verdict to the Nobel Committee's phone call, it seemed impossible that both could be part of the same life story. But perhaps that was the most important lesson of all. Potential is often hidden, misrecognized, and the human capacity for growth and achievement far exceeds what any single assessment can capture. The girl who had been labeled as mentally deficient was about to receive the highest honor in science, not despite her early struggles, but perhaps because of how those struggles had shaped her into someone who thought differently, saw patterns others missed, and refused to accept limitations imposed by others. Stockholm awaited. Along with the culmination of a journey that had begun in a third-grade classroom with words that were meant to limit but had ultimately inspired a lifetime of proving them wrong, 3 weeks after returning from Stockholm, still adjusting to life as a Nobel laureate, I was sorting through the enormous pile of congratulatory mail that had accumulated during my trip to Sweden. Letters from fellow scientists, students inspired by my story, and strangers who had read about my journey filled several boxes in my Chicago office. That's when I found a cream-colored envelope with elegant calligraphy that stood out among the academic correspondence. The return address reads Sarah Henderson Mitchell, with a local Chicago address I didn't recognize. Henderson. The name stopped me cold. Inside was a formal wedding anniversary invitation. Mr. and Mrs. Robert Henderson request the pleasure of your company at the celebration of their 40th wedding anniversary. Saturday, November 18th, 2024, 6 p.m. The Palmer House, Hilton, Chicago. My hands trembled as I read the accompanying handwritten note. Dear Dr. Walters, I'm Sarah Henderson Mitchell, daughter of Robert and Margaret Henderson. I hope you remember me from elementary school. I was a few years behind you at Riverside. I can't believe our little school produced a Nobel Prize winner. My parents would be absolutely honored if you could attend their anniversary celebration as our guest of honor. Your achievement has brought such pride to our entire community. Please say yes. With admiration, Sarah. I sat back in my chair, the invitation feeling impossibly heavy in my hands. Mrs. Henderson, Margaret Henderson, was the teacher who had branded me as mentally deficient, who had told my parents I would never amount to anything, whose words had haunted me for years. And now her daughter, completely unaware of our history, was inviting me to celebrate her mother's anniversary as a guest of honor. The irony was breathtaking. Sarah clearly had no idea that her mother had once crushed my educational dreams, had recommended my placement in special education, had convinced my parents that their daughter was cognitively limited. To Sarah, I was simply a distinguished alumna who had brought honor to their community. I stared at the invitation for a long time, my mind racing through possibilities. I could decline politely, claiming scheduling conflicts. I could accept and simply enjoy the celebration without mentioning the past. Or I could use this opportunity to face Mrs. Henderson directly, to show her in person how spectacularly wrong her assessment had been. The mature professional response would be to decline. There was no need to revisit old wounds or create awkward situations. I'd already proven Mrs. Henderson wrong in the most definitive way possible with a Nobel Prize. What more vindication could I possibly need? But as I read Sarah's enthusiastic note again, I felt something else stirring. Curiosity. After all these years, what would Mrs. Henderson's reaction be when she saw me? Would she remember her devastating pronouncement? Would she understand the impact her words had on my life? Would she feel any remorse for the limitations she'd tried to impose? I thought about my Nobel lecture, where I'd spoken about the importance of recognizing potential even when it's hidden beneath surface struggles. Here was an opportunity to demonstrate that principle in person, to show that the girl she'd written off had not only succeeded but had achieved the highest possible recognition in science. The invitation became another artifact in my collection, but this one was different from all the others. While my Nobel medal and lecture notes represented triumph, this cream-colored card represented unfinished business, a chance to close a circle that had been open for decades. I called my mother to discuss the situation. Mom, I received an invitation to Mrs. Henderson's anniversary party. Her daughter invited me as the guest of honor, but she has no idea about our history with her mother. There was a long pause. Oh my mother said finally. Mrs. Henderson, I haven't thought about her in years. Are you considering going? I don't know. Part of me wants to see her reaction when she realizes who I am. But another part thinks it might be better to just let the past stay in the past. Sweetheart, my mother said gently, you've already won. You don't need to prove anything to anyone, least of all to her. But if you think it would give you closure, then maybe it's worth considering. I spent days debating the decision. My colleagues thought I was crazy to even consider attending. Why would you want to relive that trauma? Dr. Kim asked during our weekly lab meeting. You're a Nobel laureate now. Let that be enough. But Grandma Rose, when I visited her at the assisted living facility, had a different perspective. Sometimes, she said, her eyes still sharp at 89, we need to show people the full consequences of their words and actions. Not for revenge, but for education. Maybe seeing you will help her understand how wrong she was and prevent her from crushing some other child's dreams. That decided it. I wasn't going for revenge or vindication. I'd already achieved that through my scientific success. I was going for the possibility that this encounter might teach an important lesson about the danger of limiting expectations, about the importance of nurturing potential rather than dismissing it. IRSVPD to Sarah, accepting the invitation and thanking her for the honor of being asked. I didn't mention my history with her mother. That revelation would come naturally during the event itself. As November 18th approached, I found myself nervous in a way I hadn't experienced since receiving the Nobel call, facing peer review, defending my research, even delivering my Nobel lecture. None of that had prepared me for the prospect of confronting the teacher who had nearly derailed my educational journey. I chose my outfit carefully, a simple but elegant black dress with my Nobel Prize pin prominently displayed on the lapel. I wanted to look professional but not ostentatious, successful but not vindictive. The goal was to present myself as the accomplished scientist I'd become, not as the wounded child still seeking approval. The night before the party, I rehearsed potential conversations in my mind. How would I introduce myself to Mrs. Henderson? How would I respond to her likely shock and possible embarrassment? How could I handle the situation with grace while still making the important point about the consequences of limiting expectations? The invitation sat on my dresser, a reminder of the strange turn my life had taken. 3 weeks earlier, I'd been receiving a Nobel Prize from the King of Sweden. Tomorrow, I would be confronting the elementary school teacher who had once predicted I would never amount to anything. The symmetry was almost poetic. The girl who had been crushed by harsh words in a third-grade classroom was now returning as a woman who had achieved the highest possible recognition in science. Mrs. Henderson was about to learn the most important lesson of her teaching career, that potential can't be contained by other people's limited vision, and that the students we dismiss might surprise us in ways we never imagined. The cream-colored invitation had opened a door to the past, but I would walk through it as the Nobel laureate I'd become, ready to close this chapter of my story once and for all. The Palmer House Hilton's grand ballroom was decorated with white roses and golden anniversary accents. When I arrived at 6 o'clock sharp, 200 guests mingled in elegant evening attire, their conversations creating a warm buzz of celebration. I paused at the entrance, my Nobel Prize pin catching the light from the crystal chandeliers, and took a deep breath before stepping into the room. Sarah Henderson Mitchell spotted me immediately and rushed over with obvious excitement. She was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and her mother's determined chin, dressed in a flowing navy dress that complemented the anniversary theme. Dr. Walters. I can't believe you actually came, she exclaimed, grasping my hands warmly. This is such an honor. Wait until you meet my parents. They're going to be absolutely thrilled. A Nobel Prize winner at their anniversary party. I smiled, feeling a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. Thank you for inviting me, Sarah. It's lovely to celebrate such a milestone with your family. She led me through the crowd, stopping frequently to introduce me to relatives and family friends. This is Dr. Kristine Walters, the Nobel Prize winner. She went to Riverside Elementary with me. Each introduction generated excited congratulations and requests for photos, but I found myself scanning the room for Mrs. Henderson, wondering where she was and how she would react when she saw me. There they are, Sarah said suddenly, pointing toward the head table where an elderly couple sat accepting congratulations from a steady stream of well-wishers. Mom, Dad, come meet our special guest. Mrs. Henderson looked up at Sarah's call, and I felt my breath catch. She was now 73 years old. Her once severe hair softened 2 silver waves, her face lined with age but still carrying the authoritative bearing I remembered from childhood. She wore an elegant burgundy dress with a corsage of white roses, every inch the dignified matriarch celebrating her 40th wedding anniversary. As Sarah approached with me in tow, Mrs. Henderson's expression was one of polite curiosity. She clearly didn't recognize me, not surprising, given how much I'd changed since I was 8 years old. But I would never forget her face, those sharp eyes that had once looked at me with such dismissive certainty. Mom, Dad, I want you to meet Dr. Kristine Walters, Sarah announced proudly. She's the Nobel Prize winner I told you about. She went to Riverside Elementary. Mrs. Henderson rose gracefully from her chair, extending her hand with practiced social grace. Dr. Walters, What an absolute honor. She stopped mid-sentence, her hand freezing in the air between us. Recognition dawned slowly across her features, her eyes widening as memory connected the accomplished woman before her with the struggling child from decades past. "Kristine," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the party noise. "Kristine Walters. But you, you were, I was in your third-grade class," I said gently, taking her frozen hand and shaking it with quiet dignity. "It's wonderful, too. See you again, Mrs. Henderson?" The color drained from her face. Around us, the anniversary celebration continued, but I could see the moment she remembered everything: the parent-teacher conference, her devastating assessment, her recommendation for special education placement. Her hand trembled in mine before she pulled it back, her composure cracking visibly. "I don't understand," Sarah said, looking between us with confusion. "You two know each other. That's wonderful. Mom, isn't this amazing? Your former student won the Nobel Prize." Mrs. Henderson sank back into her chair, her hand pressed to her chest. "The Nobel Prize," she repeated faintly. "You won the Nobel Prize in chemistry." "Yes," I confirmed, my voice steady but not unkind. "For my work on quantum molecular dynamics. It's been quite a journey since Riverside Elementary." Sarah was beaming, completely oblivious to the tension crackling between her mother and me. "Mom, you must be so proud. Did you know back then that Kristine would become such a distinguished scientist?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Mrs. Henderson's eyes met mine, and I saw in them a mix of shock, recognition, and growing realization of what her words had nearly cost the world. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again. Unable to form words, I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, showing her a photo from the Stockholm ceremony. "This is from December 8th, when I delivered my Nobel lecture at the Karolinska Institute. The title was Quantum Coherence in Molecular Systems, from Computational Anomalies to Revolutionary Applications." Mrs. Henderson stared at the image, me standing at the podium where Nobel laureates had spoken for over a century, addressing an audience of distinguished scientists from around the world. Her face had gone completely pale. "I remember our last conversation very clearly," I continued, my voice remaining gentle but carrying unmistakable weight. "You told my parents that I was mentally deficient, that I would never amount to anything academically. You recommended that I be placed in special education for developmentally delayed children." Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Mom, is this true?" Mrs. Henderson's silence was answer enough. She seemed to have aged years in the span of minutes, the weight of her long-ago words suddenly crushing down upon her. "I also remember," I continued, "that you said I lacked the cognitive ability to succeed academically, that continuing in regular classes would be cruel to me and unfair to other students. You were very certain of your assessment." The celebration around us had begun to quiet as nearby. Guests sensed the drama unfolding at the head table. Mrs. Henderson's husband looked confused and concerned, while Sarah stood frozen in mortification. "Dr. Walters," Mrs. Henderson finally managed, her voice cracking. I don't know what to say. I was so wrong. So terribly, catastrophically wrong." "Yes," I agreed, simply. "You were." She pressed her hands to her face, and I could see tears beginning to form. "I could have destroyed your entire future. If other teachers hadn't intervened, if you hadn't found people who believed in you, double quotes, but they did," I said firmly, "and I did. That's what I want you to understand, Mrs. Henderson. Your assessment wasn't just wrong about MIT, was wrong about how potential works, about how intelligence manifests, about the danger of giving up on students who think differently." The crowd around us had grown quiet, sensing they were witnessing something significant. I reached into my purse again and pulled out the Stockholm ceremony program, the one I'd kept as an artifact of my ultimate achievement. "This is the program from the Nobel Prize ceremony," I said, holding it so she could see my name printed among the year's laureates. "The girl you said would never amount to anything is now Dr. Kristine Walters, Nobel laureate in chemistry." Mrs. Henderson looked at the program, then back at me, her face crumpling with the full weight of her realization. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I'm so incredibly sorry. I was wrong about everything." The apology hung in the air between us, decades overdue but finally spoken. Around us, 200 guests had fallen silent, witnessing a moment of reckoning that none of them had expected when they came to celebrate a wedding anniversary in that moment. Looking at Mrs. Henderson's tear-filled eyes and genuine remorse, I felt something shift inside me. The anger I'd carried for so long, the need for vindication that had driven me for decades, suddenly seemed less important than the lesson this moment could teach. The silence in the ballroom stretched for what felt like an eternity. 200 guests watched as Mrs. Henderson sat with tears streaming down her face. Finally understanding the magnitude of her mistake from decades past, I looked at this elderly woman who had once held such power over my future, and instead of triumph, I felt something unexpected: compassion. "Mrs. Henderson," I said gently, taking the seat beside her, "I didn't come here for revenge. I came because I wanted you to understand something important about the students you teach." She looked up at me through her tears, unable to speak. "Every child who walks into a classroom carries infinite potential," I continued, my voice carrying clearly across the now silent ballroom. "Some show it in obvious ways. They read early, follow instructions perfectly, excel at everything. But others, like I was, show it differently. They ask unusual questions. They struggle with conventional methods. They think in patterns that don't fit standard expectations." Sarah moved closer, her face pale with the realization of what her mother had almost cost the world. "Dr. Walters, I had no idea." "I'm so sorry. You have nothing to apologize for," I assured her. "But this moment is important, not just for your mother and me, but for everyone here who has influence over young minds." I turned back to Mrs. Henderson, who was listening intently despite her distress. "I spent 26 years carrying your words with me. Every time I faced a challenge, every time I doubted myself, I heard your voice saying I wasn't smart enough, that I'd never amount to anything. Those words nearly destroyed my confidence countless times." "I'm so ashamed," she whispered. "I thought I was being realistic, protective. I thought I was helping you adjust to your limitations. But here's what I've learned," I said, my voice growing stronger. "The limitations weren't mine, they were in how others saw me. I had dyslexia, which made reading difficult, but that same neurological difference gave me the ability to visualize molecular structures in ways that led to breakthrough discoveries. What you saw as deficiency was actually a different kind of brilliance." The crowd remained transfixed. This was no longer just a personal confrontation. It had become an impromptu lesson about potential, perception, and the responsibility we all have toward young minds. "Mrs. Henderson, how many other students did you teach over your career?" I asked gently. "Hundreds," she managed, "maybe over 1,000. "And how many of them did you assess as I was assessed? How many bright minds did you redirect away from their dreams because they didn't fit conventional patterns?" The question hung heavy in the air. She closed her eyes and I could see her mentally reviewing decades of teaching, wondering how many futures she might have inadvertently limited. "I don't know," she said finally. "I followed the accepted practices, the diagnostic criteria. I thought I was being professional, and maybe some of those assessments were correct," I acknowledged, "but maybe some weren't. Maybe there were other students like me, with hidden gifts that just needed the right recognition and support." Sarah spoke up suddenly, her voice emotional. "Mom, remember Tommy Garcia? You recommended him for special education too? He's now an engineer at Boeing. And Maria Santoschi became a veterinarian, despite your prediction that she'd never handle advanced science." Mrs. Henderson's face crumpled further as more examples of her misassessments came to light. But I reached over and took her hand. Stopping the litany, "The past can't be changed," I said firmly, "but the future can be. The question is, what will you do with this knowledge?" She looked at me with surprise. "What do you mean? You're retired from teaching, but you still have influence, grandchildren perhaps, community involvement, opportunities to share what you've learned about the danger of limiting expectations?" For the first time since recognizing me, Mrs. Henderson straightened slightly. Yes, I have 5 grandchildren. 2 of them are struggling in school." "Then help them," I said simply. "Help their teachers see potential instead of problems. Share your story, how wrong you were about me, and how that taught you to look deeper, to nurture different kinds of intelligence, to believe in possibilities rather than limitations." The transformation in her expression was remarkable. The shame and regret were still there, but they were being joined by something else: purpose. "I could speak to parent groups," she said slowly, "to new teachers. I could share what I've learned about the consequences of giving up on students too quickly." "Exactly," I smiled. "That would be the greatest honor you could give to my achievement. That other students don't face what I faced." At that moment, a young voice piped up from the crowd. A girl about 8 years old, clearly one of Mrs. Henderson's great-grandchildren, had been listening to our conversation with wide eyes. "Great-grandma," she said, approaching our table with a folded piece of paper in her hand. "I drew you a picture, but my teacher says I'm not very good at art and should focus on reading instead." Mrs. Henderson looked at the child, then at me, then back at her great-granddaughter. With shaking hands, she accepted the drawing, a colorful representation of molecules that looked remarkably sophisticated for an 8-year-old's work. "This is beautiful, sweetie," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice thick with emotion. "Tell me about these shapes. How did you know to draw them this way?" As the little girl excitedly explained her artistic interpretation of the invisible world of atoms and molecules. I felt a profound sense of completion. This child, curious, creative, thinking in visual patterns that might not fit conventional educational expectations, was receiving the encouragement I had desperately needed at her age. After the party ended and most guests had departed, Mrs. Henderson approached me one final time. In her hands was a handwritten note that she pressed into mine. "Dr. Walters, I've written a letter that I'd like to share with educator groups if you'll permit it. It's my apology not just to you but to every student I may have underestimated. I want to spend whatever time I have left making sure other teachers don't make the mistakes I made." I unfolded the note and read her careful handwriting to all educators. "I once told a brilliant child that she would never amount to anything. Last night, I met that child again. She is now a Nobel Prize winner who has revolutionized chemistry and potentially saved countless lives. My assessment wasn't just wrong, it was dangerous. Every student deserves to have their potential recognized and nurtured, especially those who think differently. We must do better." The note became my final artifact from this journey. Trophy of victory, but a promise of change. A commitment to ensuring that other children wouldn't face the limitations I had overcome. 6 months later, I received an email with a photo attached. It was Mrs. Henderson speaking to a group of new teachers. My Nobel Prize photo displayed prominently behind her as she shared our story. The subject line read, "Thank you for teaching me the most important lesson of my career." The girl who had been told she would never amount to anything had not only achieved the highest honors in science, she had transformed her greatest critic into an advocate for recognizing potential in every child. The circle was complete, but the ripple effects would continue for generations. Sometimes the greatest victories aren't just personal, they're the changes we inspire in others, the barriers we break down for those who come after us, and the hope we kindle in every child who dares to dream beyond other people's expectations. Mrs. Henderson's prediction had been spectacularly wrong, but in the end, proving her wrong had become something even more valuable, a lesson in the unlimited potential that exists within every struggling student, waiting for someone who believes enough to help it shine.